She had been in a coma for 20 years, and no one believed she would ever wake up, until a nurse lifted the blanket and screamed. What did she see? Watch until the end and comment where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The night had settled over Savannah like a soft velvet curtain, wrapping the college town in gentle silence. Street lights hummed faintly as their warm amber glow spilled onto empty sidewalks, casting elongated shadows of trees and parked cars. Inside the campus library, tucked into the back corner at her usual table, Aaliyah James was carefully copying notes into her notebook, her pen moving with quiet determination. The desk lamp cast a golden halo over her neat braids and the sleeves of her faded denim jacket. To anyone watching, she looked like just another college student burning the midnight oil. But for Aaliyah, every late night was a promise she refused to break. At 20 years old, Aaliyah carried more weight on her slim shoulders than most of her classmates ever would. Orphaned since her mother's death 2 years prior, she had no siblings, no extended family she spoke to, and no safety net. Her world was built on books, on lectures, on her dreams of becoming a writer. Her professors admired her intellect, and her peers often mistook her quiet nature for shyness, not realizing the years of caregiving and solitude that had shaped her. That particular Thursday evening was like any other. Aaliyah had stayed later than planned, organizing a shelf of returned books before slipping her notebook and pens into her worn canvas bag. She paused at the circulation desk, waved goodnight to the night shift assistant, and stepped into the crisp autumn air. Her car, an old silver Honda Civic with a dented bumper, was parked under a flickering street lamp. She unlocked it, tossed her bag into the passenger seat, and sent a quick text to her friend Maya. Heading home. Talk tomorrow. No one saw her after that. The following morning, commuters found the Civic idling at the edge of Highway 204, front wheels on the gravel shoulder, the backlight blinking weakly. Inside, Aaliyah was slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious, blood pooling from a shallow gash on her forehead. There was no ID, no phone, no purse, only a campus sticker on the rear windshield hinting at where she might belong. The paramedics acted quickly, noting that she was breathing, pulse faint but steady. They stabilized her, loaded her into the ambulance, and raced to Chatham County General Hospital. Dr. Harris, a sleep-deprived ER physician, examined her while nurses cut away her stained clothes. A brain scan revealed mild swelling, and though there was no fracture, the blow to her head had left her in a coma. She was assigned a temporary name, Jane Doe, female, African American, early 20s, and transferred to the neurology wing. There, she was placed under continuous monitoring, an IV threaded into her arm, a breathing tube carefully secured. Machines hummed at her bedside, their blinking lights forming the heartbeat of her artificial consciousness. The hospital's social worker made inquiries but had little to go on. Without ID, emergency contact, or even fingerprints in the system, Aaliyah became another lost body in the bureaucracy of medical anonymity. The nursing staff moved on to more pressing cases, and doctors turned their attention to patients with clearer outcomes. But one person refused to see her as a case number. Viola Harper had been a nurse at Chatham County General for nearly 35 years. She'd seen bodies broken and restored, lives ended and saved, but something about the girl in room 213 made her pause. Maybe it was the stillness of her face, the delicate arch of her eyebrows, or the way her hand, even in unconsciousness, rested gently over her stomach like a protective gesture. Or maybe it was that she looked like Viola's granddaughter, Jasmine, who had passed 10 years prior from leukemia at the age of 8. Viola didn't believe in coincidence, but she believed in compassion. She began spending extra time in room 213, brushing the girl's hair, moisturizing her skin, and speaking to her in soft tones. She read her the Psalms from memory and hummed old gospel songs, hoping her voice would somehow penetrate the fog of Coma. The nurses nicknamed the girl Sleeping Beauty, a moniker that, while whimsical, seemed to fit. Her features were striking: high cheekbones, soft brown skin, and long, curled lashes that rested like feathers on her cheeks. Days turned into weeks. Tests showed little change, but her vitals remained stable. Viola stayed late after her shifts, sitting beside the bed, holding the girl's hand. Her co-workers began to notice. "You've adopted her, haven't you?" one nurse teased. Viola chuckled softly. Somebody's got to care. Then came the administrative meeting. The hospital board, concerned about resource allocation, brought up the subject of Jane Doe. Without an identity, insurance, or family to advocate, her continued care strained the already tight budget. A motion was raised to consider withdrawing life support. Viola sat stiffly in the back of the room, her knuckles clenched. "No," she said, her voice low but firm. "She's not a lost cause." Dr. Coleman, the hospital's chief of medicine, leaned forward. "Nurse Harper, with respect, we have limited beds and more critical patients. We've given this girl weeks. If she had any sign of neurological improvement," Viola interrupted him, "she's not alone. She's loved. That should count for something." There was silence. Some members of the board shifted uncomfortably. Finally, it was decided that treatment would continue, temporarily. If no change occurred within 2 months, the issue would be reconsidered. After the meeting, Viola walked slowly back to room 213. She stood at the doorway, watching the steady rise and fall of the girl's chest. The machines beeped softly, a rhythm that had become familiar. She sat down, pulled the chair close, and whispered, "I don't know your name, baby, but I'm not giving up on you." Still, the mystery remained. Who was she? Where had she come from? Viola took matters into her own hands. One evening, she carefully removed the girl's hospital gown to check for distinguishing marks. On her left shoulder, barely visible under the skin, was a faded tattoo. A tiny paper airplane with the letters AJ curled inside its wings. Viola took a photo and posted it online with a brief message. "Do you know this girl? Found near Highway 204 in a coma. Please share." She didn't expect much, but within 24 hours the post had been shared over 1,000 times. Students from Savannah State began commenting, some recognizing her face. Then came a breakthrough. A professor at the university saw the image and contacted the hospital. "Her name is Aaliyah James," she said. "She's one of my students. Brilliant girl. This is unthinkable." The news struck Viola like a jolt. She ran to the room, clutching the printed email. "You're Aaliyah," she whispered. "You have a name. You're not lost anymore." The hospital staff adjusted the records. Jane Doe became Aaliyah James, but even with her identity restored, no family came forward. Records showed her mother deceased, her father absent, and no listed next of kin. The college confirmed her student status but couldn't provide legal guardianship. Once again, Aaliyah floated in limbo, recognized but still alone. Still, something had changed. Viola no longer felt like she was caring for a stranger. She began bringing in Aaliyah's favorite books, discovered through the college library's database: James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou. She read aloud every evening. On Sundays, she brought fresh flowers and laid them on the windowsill. She cleaned Aaliyah's hands and braided her hair with careful tenderness. The nickname Sleepin' Beauty began to spread beyond the hospital. Local news ran a story about the unknown student found in a coma. Donations trickled in. Students held a vigil on campus, candles glowing in the dark as prayers were whispered for a girl many hadn't even met. And still Aaliyah slept. The machines kept time with her silence. Viola's devotion became unwavering, rooted in something deeper than duty. She saw in Aaliyah not only a reflection of the granddaughter she had lost, but also a symbol of all the young black women who had ever gone unheard, unseen, unprotected. She vowed to protect her, no matter how long it took. Outside, the days grew shorter, the leaves turning crisp and red. Inside, room 213, the girl with the gentle hands remained motionless, caught between two worlds. And somewhere beyond comprehension, a storm had already begun to gather. The first chill of winter crept through Savannah as December settled over the city, painting windows with condensation and turning early sunsets into long, brooding evenings. In room 213, nothing seemed to change. Aaliyah James remained in her coma, unmoved by the shift in seasons or the passage of time. Machines still kept her breathing steady. Tubes still delivered nutrition and medication. Nurses still rotated through her room every 4 hours to check her vitals. But for Viola Harper, everything had changed the day she learned the girl's name. Now that she could speak to her directly, with purpose and identity, the connection deepened. "Aaliyah," Viola would whisper as she brushed a warm cloth across her brow. "You've got people praying for you now, baby." And it was true. The moment the hospital updated her records and the post with the tattoo photo had gone viral, her name had sparked something powerful across the Savannah State University campus. Students who had once passed Aaliyah in hallways without a second glance were now organizing candlelight vigils. Professors mentioned her in class, referring to her sharp mind, her thoughtful essays, her quiet brilliance. A group of students created a small memorial in the student union, with her photograph, flowers, and sticky notes filled with encouragement and memories. "You always helped me study when I was lost. You made me believe I belonged here. Come back, Aaliyah. We need you." The university's administration reached out to the hospital to confirm the reports. Viola was present during the phone call and provided the details she had gathered, her voice steady, though her hand trembled slightly as she clutched her notebook. It didn't take long for them to confirm that Aaliyah was indeed enrolled as a full-time student in their creative writing program. She had a spotless record, scholarships earned through merit, and had been expected to complete her junior year with honors. But even with her identity confirmed, the fundamental issue remained. No family, no legal guardian, no one to authorize continued care or take responsibility for her long-term prognosis. The college offered symbolic support, and the students provided emotional solidarity. But the hospital board still looked at her as an unclaimed ward of the system, one whose cost continued to mount with each day of care. Viola wasn't a woman of wealth. She lived alone in a modest house on the west side of town, her income modest, her retirement years not far off. But she wasn't ready to let Aaliyah go, not when the girl had been given a name, not when hope, however distant, had begun to bloom like a fragile flower in the frost. One evening, after reading to Aaliyah from Maya Angelou's "I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings," Viola packed up her tote bag and walked home beneath the dull glow of street lamps. Her steps were slow, her back aching, but her mind sharp with purpose. That night, at her kitchen table, She opened her old laptop, connected it to the internet with stubborn persistence, and created a GoFundMe page. The title was simple: Help Aaliyah James Keep Fighting. She uploaded photos of the girl's bedside, a snapshot of her student ID provided by the college, and a message straight from the heart. I've watched over this young woman for nearly 2 months. She's brave, beautiful, and fighting for her life. Aaliyah has no parents left to advocate for her, but she's not alone. I believe in her, and I believe that together we can give her the time she needs to wake up. She hit publish and went to bed unsure whether anyone would even see it. By morning, the page had been shared hundreds of times. Donations began trickling in. $5, $10, $25 from someone in Texas who had never met Aaliyah but was moved by her story. By the end of the week, over $8,000 had been raised. A local news anchor picked up the story, airing a brief segment that ended with Viola standing beside Aaliyah's bed, gently holding her hand. "She's still in there," Viola said softly. "I can feel it." Hospital staff began treating the girl differently. The nickname Sleeping Beauty returned, not as a joke but as a term of endearment. Volunteers brought flowers. Students dropped off cards and poems. The college arranged for Aaliyah's tuition to be frozen, her status held open for the day she returned. Viola continued to serve as her unofficial guardian. She signed for deliveries, coordinated care with the nurses, and ensured that her skin was massaged daily to prevent pressure sores. She brought coconut oil for her scalp and silk scarves to cover her hair, unwilling to let the girl's dignity fade with her consciousness. As the second month wore on, Viola noticed subtle signs. Aaliyah's eyelashes fluttered more often, her fingers twitched unpredictably. The doctors warned against false hope. Involuntary muscle spasms, they said, not indicative of neurological recovery. But Viola held on to the tiny moments as signs that Aaliyah was still present, still fighting. Then, one Sunday afternoon, as rain tapped gently against the window pane, Viola leaned over and whispered, "It's okay, baby. Take your time. I'll be here." At that moment, Aaliyah's hand shifted, just slightly, but it moved toward Viola's fingers. Not away, toward. Viola's breath caught in her chest. She squeezed back, tears welling up in her eyes. She rushed to get a nurse who confirmed the movement but recorded it cautiously. Still, for Viola, it was the first true spark she had seen. That evening, she stayed long past her shift, praying softly under her breath, her hands clasped in quiet determination. Elsewhere, however, the hospital administration was watching the funds closely. Despite the growing support, the board remained cautious. Dr. Frederick Coleman, the chief of medicine, advocated for continued care, but began warning that public interest would eventually fade. "We cannot operate a hospital on sentiment," he said in a closed-door meeting. Viola heard the words but didn't flinch. She had been a nurse too long to be shaken by men in suits. Her life had taught her the power of persistence, of outlasting storms. Over the holidays, the GoFundMe passed $20,000. Local churches held bake sales and prayer circles. The Black Student Union from the college arranged a fundraiser concert. Community leaders began to speak Aaliyah's name during town halls, naming her a symbol of resilience and forgotten youth. Through it all, Viola remained the constant. On a quiet January morning, a man arrived at the hospital asking for Aaliyah. He was in his mid-30s, wore a rumpled suit, and carried a laptop bag. He introduced himself as Marcus Ellison, a social worker from Atlanta who had grown up with Aaliyah's mother. He had seen the news and traced the story back to her. He came bearing photos, old letters, and most importantly, the power to petition for limited guardianship on Aaliyah's behalf. Viola didn't trust him at first. Too many people had already turned away. But Marcus was kind, patient, and persistent. He shared stories of Aaliyah as a child, of her mother's strength, of the difficult road that had brought them to where they were. With his help, the legal process moved forward. Papers were filed, court hearings scheduled, and though nothing changed for Aaliyah physically, it was a milestone. For the first time since her accident, she was not a legal ghost. The day the judge signed the papers giving Marcus and Viola joint temporary guardianship, Viola returned to room 213 and sat beside Aaliyah's bed, her eyes filled with warmth. "You've got people now," she said. "We're not giving up." She opened a fresh notebook and began reading aloud from a poem written by one of the students who had visited. "When your voice is gone, we will sing for you. When your eyes are closed, we will watch the world until you can see it again. You are not forgotten. You are not invisible. You are loved." And the wind outside howled gently against the glass as if echoing the promise. Spring crept into Savannah with the reluctant warmth of a city unsure whether it wanted to let go of winter. Buds began to dot the trees along Victory Drive, and the sun lingered just a little longer in the sky each evening. Inside room 213, however, the season made no difference. The blinds remained partially closed, the artificial glow of the monitors still painting the girl's face in pale blue tones. Aaliyah James remained in her coma, silent and still, her breathing steady thanks only to the machines that had become her lifeline. By now, almost 6 months had passed since her accident. The novelty of her story had faded in the public eye. The GoFundMe page, once bursting with activity, now saw only the occasional donation, a trickle rather than the stream it had been during its peak. The local news had moved on. Only a few students still visited regularly, usually leaving cards or folded notes by her bed. The flowers came less frequently. The hospital, as Viola had feared, began to see Aaliyah not as a living soul, but as a line item on a ledger. Still, Viola remained. Her shifts were shorter now. Age and arthritis had begun to slow her, but she never failed to stop by room 213. She had made a habit of reading to Aaliyah from her college writing portfolio, provided by one of her former professors. Viola had read those essays so many times she could nearly recite them from memory, but each time she read them aloud, it was with the same gentle inflection, the same unwavering belief that Aaliyah could hear her. "You've got a voice, baby girl," Viola would say softly, holding her hand. "A strong one. You just need to wake up and use it." Dr. Frederick Coleman had become more involved with Aaliyah's care in recent months. He was a tall, composed man with silver at his temples and a voice that rarely rose above a professional murmur. He had a reputation for competence, not warmth, but he was respected by all. Married, with 3 children in college, he carried himself like someone who had long ago mastered the art of compartmentalization. He spoke to Viola politely when necessary, often during updates or meetings, but never lingered. "He's watching his reputation," one of the nurses once whispered to Viola. "This whole thing's made him nervous." Viola nodded but said nothing. Something in Dr. Coleman's manner always unsettled her. There was no obvious reason to suspect him. He had donated generously to Aaliyah's fund and publicly advocated for her continued care. But there was a coldness in his eyes that Viola had learned not to ignore. Still, she pushed the feeling aside. The hospital needed every ally it could get. It was during a Thursday night shift around the end of March that the first real alarm was raised. Rachel Nguyen, a young nurse just a year into her rotation, was doing her usual rounds when she paused outside room 213. She checked Aaliyah's chart and entered quietly, expecting the usual. Check vitals, adjust bedding, make notes. But as she pulled back the blanket slightly to reposition a monitor cord, she froze. There was a distinct roundness to Aaliyah's lower abdomen. It wasn't bloating. It wasn't fluid retention. Rachel stepped back and stared. She was no doctor, but she'd seen enough pregnant women during her clinicals to recognize the shape. She didn't say anything that night. Instead, she returned the blanket, completed her notes, and left the room in a haze of unease. At the nurse's station, she pulled up Aaliyah's records again. No notes about reproductive issues, no reports of missed menstrual cycles, nothing that would explain what she'd seen. She decided to speak with Viola the next day. When Viola arrived the following morning, Rachel pulled her aside in the break room, her voice low. I think she might be pregnant," Rachel said. Viola stared at her for a long moment, then set her coffee cup down slowly. "That's not possible," she said. "She's been in a coma." Rachel nodded, biting her lip. "I know, but something's not right. Someone should check." Viola felt a deep, cold knot begin to form in her stomach. She didn't argue. Instead, she walked straight to Dr. Coleman's office and waited outside his door until he returned from his rounds. When she told him what Rachel had said, he frowned, but not in surprise, more like irritation. "I'll have her examined," he said shortly. "Likely just gastrointestinal. These things can appear misleading in coma patients." But the examination never took place, not then, not the next day. A week passed. Viola followed up only to be told that the doctor had reviewed the case and found no clinical reason to pursue further tests. That answer didn't sit right. Not with Viola. Not when she began noticing it, too. The swelling that hadn't been there before. The strange shifts in Aaliyah's breathing pattern. The softness of her belly under the blankets. She asked another physician, one she trusted, to take a second look. He agreed quietly. The preliminary ultrasound confirmed everything. Aaliyah James was 8 months pregnant. Viola sat in the staff lounge after the results were printed, the images burned into her mind. Aaliyah's unconscious body growing a life inside her without consent, without awareness. Viola's hands trembled, her breath catching in her throat as the implications crashed into her all at once. This wasn't divine. This wasn't hope. This was something monstrous. She confronted Dr. Coleman the next morning, cornering him just outside the elevator. "You knew," she said, her voice shaking. "You knew, and you did nothing." He looked at her, and for the briefest moment something flickered in his eyes. Was it guilt? Resignation? It was gone too quickly. "I was waiting for confirmation," he said. "We don't rush to conclusions." Viola didn't believe him. She went to the head administrator and demanded a full investigation. The hospital began a quiet internal review, requesting DNA tests from all male staff who had access to room 213. Whispered conversations spread across the halls. Nurses traded glances. Some avoided Viola's eyes. Others offered quiet solidarity. Then, without warning, Dr. Coleman took a leave of absence. The hospital claimed it was unrelated, stress, burnout, personal matters. But Viola knew better. 2 weeks later, a junior administrator passed her a manila envelope without speaking. Inside were stills from a deleted surveillance tape, captured at night, time-stamped between 2 and 3 a.m. It showed Dr. Coleman entering room 213 alone. Multiple times, unscheduled, unlogged, Viola felt her world drop out from under her. She went to the police. The story broke within 48 hours. Headlines blared across local news: comatose patient found pregnant. Doctor under investigation. Crowds gathered outside the hospital demanding justice. Protesters held signs with Aaliyah's face, chanting for accountability. Students marched from campus to the hospital steps. The GoFundMe page saw a second life, exploding with donations and comments of support. Dr. Coleman was arrested within days, charged with multiple felonies. He denied everything. His lawyers claimed the DNA tests were flawed, the evidence circumstantial, but the public had already drawn its verdict. Within the hospital, chaos reigned. The administration was in full damage control. Donors pulled support. The board held emergency meetings to determine liability. Staff morale plummeted. Nurses were told not to speak to the press. Security was increased. And through it all, Aaliyah remained asleep. Viola stayed by her side as the world around them burned. She no longer read poetry or sang hymns. Now she simply sat in silence, her hand resting protectively over Aaliyah's. The girl's belly was round and firm now, a life pressing outward from within her still frame. They had violated her. Viola wept, not from helplessness, but from fury, from grief, from a promise that she would not let this story end in darkness. She began meeting with lawyers, advocates, politicians. She appeared on radio shows and spoke at town halls. This didn't happen in silence, she said. It happened in neglect, and that ends now. But the funding had collapsed. With Dr. Coleman gone and public relations in shambles, the hospital announced that it could no longer continue long-term life support for patients without a private insurer. Aaliyah's time was running out. Viola begged for more time, just until the baby was born. They gave her 30 days. She spent every one of them in that room, praying for 2 lives now, one in the womb, one trapped behind the veil. And outside, Savannah held its breath. April brought with it an oppressive kind of stillness, not the gentle quiet of spring mornings or the hush of new blossoms pushing their way through the soil, but a heavy, uncomfortable silence that settled over the hospital like a shroud. No one spoke openly about what had happened, but the story was everywhere, on television screens and waiting rooms, and whispers passed between nurses over their morning coffee, and the cautious glances exchanged in elevators. Dr. Frederick Coleman's face, once synonymous with professionalism and leadership, was now plastered across headlines and news tickers as the accused. Room 213 became more than a hospital room. It was a symbol, a battlefield, a reckoning. Inside, Aaliyah James remained suspended between life and whatever waited beyond it. Her eyes stayed closed. Her lips did not move, but her belly, now full and taut, told the truth that her voice could not. The child inside her shifted and turned, an undeniable reminder of the crime committed against her. The hospital board, faced with financial collapse and mounting public pressure, had set the deadline with quiet finality: 30 days to birth. 30 days before they would withdraw life support unless an alternative was found. Viola sat at Aaliyah's bedside, her fingers interlaced with the girl's unmoving hand. Each morning she would wake before dawn, dress with mechanical efficiency, and arrive at the hospital before most of the staff. She brought her own food now, refusing to leave even for lunch. She read medical journals in the evenings, researched neonatal coma cases, and scoured legal statutes. The silence that filled room 213 was different from before. Not peaceful, not gentle. It was the silence of mourning before death, of unresolved rage, of love too deep for language. Aaliyah's breathing, sustained by machines, carried on. Her vitals remained unchanged. The baby's heart rate was strong. Nurses came and went. They no longer called her Sleeping Beauty. That name had taken on a grotesque undertone, a fairy tale soured by real-world brutality. Now they just said, the girl in 213 inches or Miss James, as if giving her formality would grant her back some of the dignity stolen from her. Viola didn't use euphemisms. She had stopped softening her words weeks ago. In meetings, she no longer tiptoed. She stared the board members in the eyes when she said, "You would never dare talk like this if she were your daughter." Marcus Ellison, now officially recognized as Aaliyah's legal advocate through emergency guardianship, had returned to Savannah from Atlanta. He was tired, having spent the last 2 weeks dealing with press inquiries, court filings, and backdoor meetings with civil rights attorneys. He met Viola every other evening to share updates and listen. Mostly listen. She didn't need speeches. She needed someone to bear witness. "They want her gone," Viola said one night, her voice flat. "They want the scandal to die with her," Marcus replied. "They're watching the public. The moment attention shifts." Viola nodded. "We have to give them a reason to keep watching." Together, they contacted every journalist who had ever shown interest. They organized community leaders. Churches were called. Students were invited to speak. A campaign, Justice for Aaliyah, was reignited, this time not as a memorial in waiting, but as a protest against passive euthanasia, against systemic neglect, against the criminal silence that had allowed abuse to flourish under fluorescent lights and corporate policies. The news cycle reignited. More articles were published. A nationally syndicated daytime talk show invited Viola and Marcus to speak via satellite. Viola sat stiffly in front of the camera, her hands folded, eyes clear. "She is still alive," she said, "and she is carrying life inside her. The least we can do is wait for that child to come into the world before we make any decisions about turning off machines. If she were a white girl from a suburban family, do you think we'd be having this conversation?" That quote was shared more than any other. Back at the hospital, staff morale fractured. Some supported Viola, others resented the attention. The board remained publicly neutral, privately anxious. Liability attorneys were called. A second internal investigation was quietly launched, this time not to find perpetrators, but to quantify risk. Meanwhile, the 30 days dwindled. At 27 days, a neonatal specialist from Atlanta arrived to assess the baby's health. She confirmed the fetus was viable for delivery, strong heartbeat, good positioning. She recommended a cesarean section as the safest route. "They want to take the baby and cut the cord," Viola told Marcus afterward, pacing the hallway. "Then they'll call it done." Marcus shook his head. "Not if she wakes up." They stood in silence, neither daring to say what they feared most, that perhaps she never would. It was on the 28th night that Viola's fear became a plea. She went to the chapel after midnight, the hospital quiet in a way that felt unnatural. She sat alone on a pew, the faint light from the stained glass windows spilling blue and crimson across the floor. "I don't know who's listening," she whispered. "I don't even know if I believe anymore. But if you're there, please, give her back to us. She suffered enough." She didn't cry. The tears had dried up long ago, but she stayed until the sun began to rise, then walked back to room 213, sat beside Aaliyah, and laid her head gently on the girl's belly. She closed her eyes and waited. That same morning, the hospital convened an emergency session. The child would be delivered within 48 hours. The equipment supporting Aaliyah would remain active for no more than 3 days following. It was the final decision. Viola refused to attend that meeting. Instead, she prepared for the birth like a grandmother awaiting a miracle. She brought a hand-sewn blanket from home, wrapped in lavender ribbon. She requested a black baby doll from a local store so the newborn wouldn't be placed in the sterile arms of a stranger while Aaliyah lay unconscious. She asked the staff to let her hold the baby immediately. For bonding, for hope, for something more than silence. On the 30th day, Aaliyah was taken to the surgical wing. Viola rode in the elevator with her, never letting go of her hand. The hallways were unusually quiet. No journalists, no protesters, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the hiss of the gurney wheels. She waited outside the OR, her hands clenched around a styrofoam cup of stale coffee. She didn't sip it. She didn't blink. Time had slowed. The operation lasted 47 minutes. At 3:16 p.m., a baby girl was born, 5 pounds, 10 ounces. She wailed immediately, her lungs strong. Viola wept when she heard the cry through the closed doors. It was the first true sound of life in months. Not machinery, not protest, but life. They brought the child to her, swaddled and blinking. She was perfect. Brown skin, soft curls, long fingers. Viola took her into her arms and kissed her forehead. "You made it," she whispered. "You made it, little one." Back in room 213, Aaliyah lay still. They placed the baby in a hospital bassinet beside her. Viola sat between them, watching, waiting. Every nurse who passed the doorway paused to look, some with guilt, some with awe. No one spoke. The next morning, a formal letter arrived. The equipment supporting Aaliyah would be turned off in 48 hours. Viola read it once and folded it neatly. She didn't speak a word. Instead, she went to the bassinet, lifted the baby, and laid her gently on Aaliyah's chest. She nestled her there, skin against skin, the tiny heartbeat pressed against the woman who had carried her across the abyss. The baby whimpered, then cried. A sharp, desperate cry, the kind that demanded something no one else could give. Viola sat back and watched. Aaliyah's chest rose and fell, then rose again. Then a blink, a shudder, a breath that wasn't mechanical. Her eyes opened. The silence shattered. The first sound was a faint gasp, not unlike the stuttered intake of air someone makes after surfacing from deep water. It was followed by a whisper so soft, so uncertain, it might have been imagined. A breath shaped into syllables by a voice that had long been silent. Viola didn't dare blink, fearing the moment would vanish if she moved. Her eyes locked on Aaliyah's face as the girl's eyelids trembled again, her lashes fluttering like wings unsure of flight. Then, with a shudder that traveled through every limb, Aaliyah James opened her eyes. There was no instant recognition, no dramatic awakening with words spilling from her lips. Instead, there was confusion, a fog of pain and effort as her gaze drifted across the ceiling, the walls, the face of the older woman beside her. But the most striking moment, the one that would be remembered long after the hospital papers were filed and the legal battles began, was when her eyes fell on the newborn pressed to her chest. The infant, still squirming softly in a loose pink wrap, let out a whimper, and Aaliyah, through cracked lips and raw throat, rasped one word, "Mama." The nurses rushed in, the sound of alarms following behind them. Machines blinked and beeped, some with delight, some with confusion. Voices filled the room, calls for doctors, demands for vitals, hurried commands to bring oxygen and fluids. But Viola, rooted to the spot, watched with tears in her eyes as the girl she had prayed for so fervently returned from the precipice, not to meet her own name, but to greet the child who had called her back. The hours that followed were a blur of medical urgency. Doctors descended on room 213 like hawks, running tests, checking for neurological response, assessing cognitive awareness. Aaliyah's eyes tracked movement. She flinched at pain. She squeezed fingers when asked, though her strength was weak and her voice barely a whisper. Her throat, unused for so long, produced sound only with great effort. She couldn't sit up, but she could blink in response to questions. Most importantly, she was breathing on her own. The hospital issued a statement to the press the next morning. It was cautious, clinical, detached. Patient previously diagnosed with prolonged unresponsive wakefulness has demonstrated spontaneous neurological response postpartum. But the world did not care for cautious language. They saw the miracle. They heard the cry of a baby and the quiet, cracked voice that followed it. The girl, who had been victim, symbol, and legal ghost, now had agency again. Her eyes were open, and so was the world's. For Viola, those first days were spent alternating between fierce advocacy and quiet devotion. She slept little, eating in snatches, often with the baby in her lap. She named the infant Amani, meaning faith, without hesitation. No one argued. The name fit too perfectly, like a whisper in the dark that finally found its voice. Aaliyah remained in a fragile state. Her movements were slow, her memory fractured. She didn't remember the crash. She didn't remember the hospital, the months in silence. She didn't understand, at first, why her body ached or why she was so thin, yet so sore. Viola explained gently, with patience and pauses. When Aaliyah asked about her mother, Viola held her hand and said only, "She passed 2 years ago, but you're not alone anymore." It was Marcus who handled the logistics. He contacted the legal teams, requested a halt to any scheduled terminations of care, and initiated a full transfer of medical authority to Aaliyah herself. He met with the hospital administrators, now stammering their apologies with sweat on their foreheads and lawyers in tow. No one wanted to be the face of the institution that had nearly allowed a living mother to die. "You were going to kill her," Marcus said to one of them. "Let's not pretend otherwise." They didn't deny it. Outside, the story caught fire again. News vans returned. Protesters shifted their slogans. What had been cries of justice for the unconscious became chants of celebration and accountability. The child, born of trauma, had awakened her mother, and now both demanded recognition. Civil rights groups called for full investigations. Healthcare reform advocates pointed to Aaliyah's case as a brutal illustration of institutional negligence. The online campaign raised nearly $200,000 in less than a week. Within the hospital, Aaliyah's room became a sanctuary. Only a handful of people were allowed inside. Viola, of course, Marcus, a pediatric nurse assigned exclusively to Amani, one trauma counselor, soft-voiced and gentle, who came only when requested. Aaliyah needed quiet. She needed time. Her body was present, but her soul was still walking slowly toward the light. It was several days before she asked the question that had haunted Viola's dreams. How did this happen? Aaliyah's voice was brittle, a leaf ready to break. Her eyes, still tired, searched Viola's for the kind of truth only a caretaker could give. Viola sat beside her and took a long breath. "There was a man," she said, "a doctor here. He hurt you, while you couldn't stop him." Aaliyah didn't cry. She didn't scream. Instead, she turned her head toward the bassinet where Amani lay sleeping. Her face was unreadable. Viola waited, expecting a flood of grief, of rage, of denial, but Aaliyah only said, "That's my baby?" "Yes," Viola said. "She's yours. She's here because of him." Viola hesitated, then, quietly, "She's here because of you, because you carried her, even without knowing." Aaliyah closed her eyes and was silent for a long time. In the days that followed, she began to interact more. Her speech grew clearer, her hands stronger. She asked for books. She requested music. Soft jazz, spoken word, old gospel. When the therapist visited again, she finally nodded. "You can stay," she said. "The recovery would be long." Physically, Aaliyah faced muscle atrophy, partial nerve damage, and the slow, grueling process of retraining her limbs to move with intention. Mentally, she would need to navigate the trauma of lost time, of stolen bodily autonomy, of a world that had gone on without her. Emotionally, she was a patchwork of resilience and heartbreak, her strength buried under layers of pain. But she had Amani, and she had Viola. One night, when the hospital halls were quiet and the windows reflected the stars, Aaliyah sat propped up in bed with Amani resting on her chest. The baby's breathing was soft and steady. Viola was in the chair nearby, half asleep, her knitting needles still in hand. "I don't think I would have made it without her," Aaliyah said suddenly. Viola stirred. "You made it because you're stronger than they knew." "She brought me back." Viola stood and crossed to her side, brushing a curl from Aaliyah's forehead. "No, baby, you came back for her." They stayed like that for a while, the room bathed in moonlight and soft monitor hums. Outside, the world argued about protocols and lawsuits, but inside room 213, there was peace. Hard-won, fragile, but real. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one no one had expected, a story no one could have written, but that Aaliyah herself would now have the power to tell. The first weeks after Aaliyah's awakening were filled with the kind of attention most people would find suffocating. There were doctors, specialists, psychiatrists, social workers, and journalists, all hovering like moths drawn to a candle they never thought would relight. Yet, despite their eagerness to study or report or analyze her recovery, Aaliyah remained shielded behind the barrier that Viola had quietly erected around her. The old nurse, still firm in her convictions, insisted that no one enter room 213 without permission. Not out of paranoia, but out of love. Aaliyah had come back from a place few returned from, and her return was not something to be dissected by strangers with microphones and agendas. The baby, Amani, was healthy and growing fast. She seemed to sense the reverence with which she was held, as though something deep inside her tiny body recognized the importance of her very existence. Her eyes, wide and curious, followed Aaliyah's face every time the young woman spoke, her head instinctively turning toward the voice that had only recently returned to the world. Viola cared for Amani with the devotion of a seasoned grandmother, but she never let Aaliyah forget that the child was hers, that every moment was now an opportunity for the bond between them to deepen. As Aaliyah grew stronger, so did her awareness. The days were long and exhausting, her body still unfamiliar after so many months in a dormant state. She cried in private sometimes, not because of the pain, but because of the absurdity of being awake in a world that had moved on without her. She watched news clips of protests with her name on cardboard signs, saw her own still images flash across television screens while newscasters narrated her tragedy. She listened to recordings of her college friends speaking at candlelight vigils, some in tears, others in anger. It was like watching the story of a stranger, one who happened to share her name. But the courtroom was real. The hearings were real. Dr. Frederick Coleman, still dressed in finely tailored suits, but now shadowed by security and attorneys, stood trial under national scrutiny. His charges ranged from aggravated sexual battery to medical misconduct and ethical violations of the highest degree. Though he pleaded not guilty, the evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA, surveillance footage, tampered records, silence from staff members who had either been complicit or too afraid to speak. Aaliyah's testimony had not been expected. Most had assumed she would remain an inactive participant in the legal process, too fragile to face the man who had violated her. But on the third day of the trial, escorted by Marcus and with Viola beside her, Aaliyah took the stand. She was pale, her body still weak, but her voice, though quiet, did not waver. She answered questions calmly, described her last memories before the crash, and confirmed her total lack of awareness of anything that had happened to her while unconscious. When asked about how she felt upon waking, about realizing she had become a mother through an act she could neither remember nor consent to, she paused, swallowed hard, and said, "I don't remember what he did, but my body does. And my daughter lives because of what he did, not for it." There was a silence in the courtroom that even the judge did not interrupt. Coleman's defense tried to paint a narrative of confusion, of error, of impossible accusations made under the weight of trauma. But the jury didn't buy it. The verdict was swift. Guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 40 years without the possibility of parole. Aaliyah did not attend the sentencing. She said all she needed to in the courtroom that day, and after she had spoken her truth, she asked to go home. Home, for now, was a quiet rehabilitation facility in the outskirts of Savannah, chosen by Viola for its peaceful grounds and no-nonsense staff. It was a place where Aaliyah could continue her recovery at her own pace, where Amani had a nursery adjacent to her room, and where Marcus visited often with updates on the status of her civil case against the hospital. The lawsuit had been filed quietly but carried weight. Hospitals were being forced to re-examine how they handled unconscious patients, particularly women of color, particularly those with no advocates. Viola had filed for legal guardianship over Aaliyah's affairs during the coma, but now that the young woman was awake and aware, she had insisted on transferring all rights back. Still, the bond between them only deepened. "You're not just someone who looked after me," Aaliyah said one day as she practiced walking short distances with a physical therapist. "You're family now. I don't care what the paperwork says." Viola's response was a tearful hug and a whispered, "You've always been mine, baby girl." Amani began to crawl at 6 months, babbling and giggling and flashing a smile that softened even the weariest nurses. Her presence brought warmth to every room she entered, a living, breathing contradiction to the trauma that had brought her into the world. And Aaliyah, though still grappling with complicated feelings, never turned away from her daughter. "I used to think she would remind me of what was taken from me," she confessed to the therapist once, "but now I realize she's what was given back." The day Aaliyah left the facility and returned to the city was unceremonious. No press, no crowd, just a van filled with donated baby items, a tired but determined young mother, and Viola carrying a casserole. They moved into a modest rental home paid for by donations from the GoFundMe and the first installment of a private settlement from the hospital's insurance provider. The house wasn't big, but it was clean, warm, and full of promise. Marcus helped set up utilities and brought groceries. Viola arranged furniture. Aaliyah unpacked Imani's clothes with careful hands, folding each tiny shirt with a reverence that made her weep when she thought no one was looking. On the first night in their new home, Aaliyah stood in the doorway of the nursery long after Imani had fallen asleep. Viola came up behind her, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Did you ever think it would be like this?" Aaliyah asked. "No," Viola said softly, "but I prayed for something close. I'm scared. You've earned the right to be, but you're not alone." The following months passed like chapters in a book she had not written, but was finally beginning to edit. Therapy continued. Interviews were turned down. Aaliyah chose privacy, preferring the rhythm of daily life to the noise of fame. But one afternoon, she agreed to a podcast interview with a young black journalist who had followed her case from the beginning. The conversation was raw, unedited, and deeply moving. When asked what she wanted the world to take from her story, Aaliyah answered, "Believe black women. Protect them when they can't speak. And when they come back, listen." The recording went viral. The podcast reached 1 million streams in less than a week. A national foundation offered to sponsor a scholarship in her name. Aaliyah declined, but suggested an alternative: create a fund for female patients in comas without legal representation or family. The foundation agreed. In court, in recovery, and in motherhood, Aaliyah had found her voice. It was not loud, but it was unflinching. She spoke when necessary, wrote often, and hugged Imani every chance she got. The nightmares didn't vanish, but they became less frequent. And when they came, Viola was often there, tea in hand, arms open, the same way she had been in room 213 every night for months. One evening, as the sun set outside their little house, Aaliyah sat with Imani on the porch. The child laughed at the wind, her tiny fingers grasping at something invisible. "You were born in silence," Aaliyah whispered, "but I promise you'll grow up in a world where your voice is heard." Inside, Viola smiled as she stirred a pot of soup, her heart full. The trial had ended. Justice had been served. But forgiveness, that most elusive form of healing, had taken root in their home, not for the man who hurt Aaliyah, but for the world that had nearly forgotten her. And from that soil, a new future was quietly beginning to grow. It began not with a headline or a speech, but with the smell of warm bread in the morning, the rustle of soft baby laughter in a sunlit room, and the quiet hum of a home learning how to live again. Aaliyah woke early most days now, her internal clock sharpened by motherhood and the gentle rhythm of survival. Her steps were still cautious, sometimes hesitant, but they no longer dragged as they once did when her muscles had forgotten the shape of walking. Recovery had become a process not of chasing who she once was, but of embracing who she was becoming. The home they shared was modest but filled with warmth. Imani had claimed every corner, her toys scattered like bright confetti across hardwood floors and colorful rugs. Viola often joked that the child ran the house, and in many ways she did. Her joy was unburdened, unaware of the trauma that had marked her entry into the world. She had her mother's eyes and her own way of looking at the world. Steadfast, curious, always forward. Aaliyah wrote often now. At first, it was tentative. Short journal entries, scribbled fragments, memories retrieved like lost buttons from the floor of her mind. Then came fuller thoughts, reflections shaped into essays, some into letters she never sent. Writing helped organize what speech sometimes could not. And eventually it gave her the power to retell her own story on her terms, not as the girl who had been violated, but as the woman who had returned. Her first public reading took place in a small community library not far from the hospital where everything had begun. It was unannounced, a low-profile event arranged by a friend of Marcus. Only a few dozen people attended. Students, community advocates, survivors, and old friends who had once lit candles for her when she was still sleeping. Viola sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes moist but proud. Aaliyah stood at the podium, a notebook open before her voice clear and slow. I used to think healing meant forgetting, that if I could just move past what happened, I'd be whole again. But I've learned that healing isn't a destination, it's a direction. Some days I move toward it, some days I stand still, but I no longer move backward. The room was silent when she finished, not because they didn't know what to say, but because everything had already been said. Her presence was the statement. Her survival was the punctuation. After the reading, a woman approached her. She was older, perhaps in her 60s, with tired eyes and a trembling voice. My niece is in a coma. She was attacked too. The hospital won't tell us anything. We don't know what to do. Aaliyah listened, not with sympathy, but with solidarity. I'll help, she said. We'll help. The foundation established in her name had grown since the settlement. Marcus had handled the legal aspects, but Aaliyah had shaped the mission. It wasn't just about funding care. It was about visibility, protection, and building a network of advocates so that no one else would be voiceless in the quiet of a hospital room. They called it the Imani Trust, named not just for the child who brought her back, but for the word itself, faith. Donations came in from all over the country. Volunteers signed up, lawyers, nurses, social workers, many of them women of color who had seen too many stories and in silence offered their time. Viola, though she avoided the spotlight, served on the board as an honorary member. She said little at meetings, but her presence carried the weight of experience that no degree could match. Imani turned one in the early spring. The house was filled with balloons and family. Viola's extended relatives, a few old classmates from college, and children from the neighborhood who brought laughter and sticky fingers. Aaliyah baked the cake herself, simple vanilla with strawberry filling, and cried when Imani smashed it with her hands and offered her mother the first bite. That night, after the last guest had left and the baby was asleep in her crib, Aaliyah sat on the back porch with Viola wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea. I still dream about the hospital sometimes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Viola nodded. That place took so much from you. But it gave me you. They sat in silence for a while, the air cool and clean, the stars blinking above as if trying to listen in. I want to tell it all, Aaliyah said. The whole story, not just what happened to me, but what came after. The parts no one wants to talk about. The grief that doesn't fit in headlines. The kind of love that's built when the world isn't watching. Viola smiled. Then you write it. The world's been telling your story long enough. Time they hear it from you. And so she did. Over the next year, Aaliyah wrote every day. Some mornings it came easily. Other days she stared at the blank page until Imani toddled into the room and broke the spell. The manuscript took shape slowly, then all at once. By the time it was done, it read not as a memoir of victimhood, but as a blueprint for survival. Publishers competed for the rights. She chose a small independent press run by black women in Atlanta. The title came to her in a dream, the sound of her name. On the day of the book's release, she held a private event in the very same hospital that had once almost buried her without a voice. The new administration had undergone a complete overhaul. Policies had changed. Cameras were now monitored by third parties. Patient advocates were present around the clock. A plaque in the hallway bore her name, not as a victim, but as a reformer. She walked the halls without bitterness. She did not flinch when she passed room 213, now occupied by another patient in recovery. Instead, she paused, whispered a prayer under her breath, and left a single flower on the windowsill. Life had not gone back to normal. It had reshaped itself around the rupture. But there was peace now, a kind that didn't demand forgetting. Aaliyah lived with memory, not in spite of it. Amani grew into a joyful, willful child with a quick laugh and a sharper tongue. She called Viola Nana and insisted on helping with breakfast every morning, even if that meant spilling half the cereal. She carried the softness of her mother and the steel of the women who had raised her in defiance of the world's cruelty. On a cool October morning, as red leaves drifted past their porch and the sky turned the color of pewter, Aaliyah sat with her daughter in her lap and read aloud from the first page of her own book. Once I was silent, not by choice, not by weakness, but because the world had forgotten I had something to say. This is the sound of me speaking. This is the sound of me returning. This is the sound of my name. Amani clapped and giggled, resting her head against her mother's chest. From the ashes of silence, Aaliyah had risen, not as a symbol, not as a cautionary tale, but as a rider, a mother, and a woman who had survived the impossible. She had awakened, and now the world listened. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos and share this one with someone who needs to see it. A plaque in the hallway bore her name, not as a victim, but as a reformer. She walked the halls without bitterness. She did not flinch when she passed room 213, now occupied by another patient in recovery. Instead, she paused, whispered a prayer under her breath, and left a single flower on the windowsill. Life had not gone back to normal. It had reshaped itself around the rupture. But there was peace now, a kind that didn't demand forgetting. Aaliyah lived with memory, not in spite of it. Amani grew into a joyful, willful child with a quick laugh and a sharper tongue. She called Viola Nana and insisted on helping with breakfast every morning, even if that meant spilling half the cereal. She carried the softness of her mother and the steel of the women who had raised her in defiance of the world's cruelty. On a cool October morning, as red leaves drifted past their porch and the sky turned the color of pewter, Aaliyah sat with her daughter in her lap and read aloud from the first page of her own book. Once I was silent, not by choice, not by weakness, but because the world had forgotten I had something to say. This is the sound of me speaking. This is the sound of me returning. This is the sound of my name. Amani clapped and giggled, resting her head against her mother's chest. From the ashes of silence, Aaliyah had risen, not as a symbol, not as a cautionary tale, but as a rider, a mother, and a woman who had survived the impossible. She had awakened, and now the world listened. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos and share this one with someone who needs to see it.